What is AI? It's not quite what we're calling AI, that we know for sure. It's something very interesting has happened in the tech sector in recent years, and it's worth looking at why that has happened. We have a subsector that is being called AI, or artificial intelligence. It's really the development of artificial intelligence. In other words, it isn't quite there yet. What we're calling AI mostly is a form of machine learning, and deep machine learning through better, more complex algorithms. And we've got to these more complex algorithms because we have better computing power and there's more data for machines to learn from. Okay, but we're calling it artificial intelligence, and why is that? And I would say it's because we've had a great big marketing job done. It's, this kind of thing has been done before. What you do is you identify a descriptor and then you occupy it. Okay? You take it over and then you grow into it. So eventually one day, the companies that are calling themselves AI startups probably will be AI startups. But for the time being, the name is stuck. The name is stuck because it's easy, because it's kind of sexy. The media love it. Consumers love it. Hollywood definitely loves it. So I think as a term, it's here to stay, even though we haven't really got intelligent computers yet, in the sense that most of us probably would understand intelligence. It's also really important to follow the money. I just always think follow the money. And it's been really important to a particular sector of investors known as venture capital. Venture capital works in a very cyclical fashion. So if they go into the tech sector and they buy a company, they need to see results from that company, usually maybe over a 5-year span, and then they'll probably sell the company off or they'll try to float it on the stock market, etc. So it's been very, very important to the venture capital sector that the current sort of batch of AI companies is marketed appropriately. They can't make the mistakes of the past, and some of the mistakes of the past have been to make AI seem very sinister and very scary. So one of the important marketing jobs that has taken place in recent years, and I've got colleagues who have been talking about this for decades, is the job of making AI seem friendly. Okay? AI, nice and short, sounds friendly. But then if you start to look at the images that are all over the internet for AI now, what you're starting to see is a replacement of the kind of Hollywood genre of, the menacing Skynet robots coming to kill you, to cuddly. They look like little teddy bears, all sorts of little fuzzy creatures. We find very human-looking bots being presented to you on the internet. You're probably being followed by them if you're using social media. And intriguingly, a lot of these bot avatars are female, and they are young. They've got this very acceptable visage. So there's a lot of money that has gone into representing the AI sector, all of the people who have been researching, doing R&D work in AI to make it seem much more acceptable to the rest of us. So we've got to a stage with AI where we've got, maybe one day we'll have lots of robots out there, but robots have been around forever. Robots with AI are going to cost a lot of money. So I would agree with all of the experts working in engineering, etc., who say, hold your horses. We're not quite there yet because of the expense of making actual robots with AI accessible in, commercial markets. But where bots are concerned, and bots have been around for a very long time as well, but bots with machine learning form of intelligence are very ready and active in dealing with consumers every day. And the thing about bots is that they're pretty cheap. You don't need a body to accompany them. You just need an avatar. And, still many bots don't even have an avatar. They don't need to go to sleep. So whatever you put them to do, to work on, they just keep doing it round the clock. So for companies that are using them for customer service now, they can use all of this customer data that is out there to learn how customers really wish to have questions answered. The travel industry has, really made inroads into using bots in this way. We know healthcare is, they're probably in the vanguard of this. Financial services, yes, to a lesser extent. But, many of us have probably had some kind of encounter with a bot without even knowing it. And we're not worried about it, which is exactly what the financial backers want. What I wanted to start making the link with first is the fact that the very category millennials is almost serving the very same purpose that artificial intelligence is at the moment. They are very important sources of growth. So on the one hand, you've got companies trying to consider whether they want to introduce AI into whether it's their customer service or their back office operations, etc., really because AI could potentially help them to offer a cheaper, more efficient service, and at the same time, if they're really lucky, make them look even sexier to the marketplace. So that's, on the one hand, that's what's happening with artificial intelligence. It's seen as a very important means of growth, especially in economies like Britain, where there really hasn't been that much growth in recent years. And even though we feel, we're being told that the economy is now on a more positive track, government, investors, economists, they're looking for that next big thing. And in many ways, artificial intelligence is being packaged as that next big thing. And it's the same with millennials as well. You would think with the constant use of the word in the media that we're talking about a very homogenous group of people. In fact, we're talking about a very large group of people who began to enter adulthood at the turn of the century. So that means that the people that we're referring to as millennials now are in many cases in their late 30s, although we've got younger ones who are also in their 20s. And what's really important about particularly that older group who are in their 30s is that they've now got to the age where they're probably stepping into jobs that give them more disposable income, or indeed some disposable income, so that they're now more in the market for big ticket items. Many of the articles that you'll see in the media are about whether millennials are going to be able to buy a house. And the real thing there is not that, oh my God, millennials can't buy a house. It's that lots of companies are trying to set themselves up as the best place for a millennial to buy a house. That's really what's going on with a lot of these stories. So we've got this really big group of consumers who are regarded as the means of growth, like they're the answer to commercial prayers. And AI is kind of the answer to a lot of commercial prayers as well. Now, where do they meet in the middle? For one thing, for companies, particularly technology companies that have gone very big on offering automated services, whether they use artificial intelligence or not, they know that the consumers who are most likely to come on board and deal with these sorts of services are the consumers who have already been used to these kinds of transactions anyway. So that they know that they're going to spend less money marketing to millennials because millennials are already of a mindset that is used to these sorts of levels of automation. The other really interesting thing in terms of the link between millennials and artificial intelligence is that this is the first generation that has had quite so much data collected on it, because they've been using internet-related devices for much longer than the generations that are ahead of them. So in a way, they're much more of a gold mine to companies that are going to be able to mine data from them. So that's the reason millennials are so attractive to companies that are using automated services. But I think beyond that, where I think that things are going to be very interesting in the medium to long term, is that government, for example, has stepped away from really wanting to think about the crucial legal and ethical implications of artificial intelligence in society for various reasons. It's not seen as a short-term issue. And the trouble is that whenever government decides that something isn't really a short-term issue, it gets, the expression is kicked into the long grass. Come the next election, whoever forms the next government will probably have other very, very different things to worry about. So in a way, I think artificial intelligence and other forms of automation are going to matter more to millennials because we're setting them up to be the ones to deal with the problems that are inevitably going to arise. They are going to be the ones who are going to have to sort out the legal issues and ramifications. They're the ones who are going to have to sort out a lot of the ethical, very, very thorny ethical issues that could arise that don't really seem to be a problem to us in the year that we're currently in, but really will be a problem for us down the line. So I think there are lots of different overlaps, which means that, you know, if you are a millennial, these are issues you need to be paying really keen attention to, because you cannot depend on your older generation to look after you. You're probably going to have to do it yourself. Mark Zuckerberg's recent performance at his congressional hearing, I think that Mark Zuckerberg was delighted with his performance. He must be. You know, the questions by and large, even though they, you know, dragged on over a number of days, were mostly benign. There were a few zingers there, but, you know, mostly benign. He would have practiced for days before he got there. But I think, you know, the reason I say he's probably delighted is that he was obviously busy with all sorts of changes in policy behind the scenes. And we've seen this very recently. It's just been announced that Facebook has moved more than 1 billion of its users from Ireland back on shore to the United States. He must have been planning that while he was planning the evidence that he was going to give before Congress. But it is still worth looking at that congressional hearing because congressional hearings, generally speaking, are a piece of theatre. And we see the same sorts of performances in the United Kingdom, whether it's the Public Accounts Committee, etc. There is a performance, but unlike going to the theatre, there is a performance going on both on the stage and off the stage. So you've got these congressional representatives, and they know that they're on television, and they know that in the case of the Facebook hearing, that this is going global. The world is watching them. And they knew the dates, so they knew they had plenty of time to prepare. And yet one of the common critiques of that hearing was how many of America's representatives just seem to be too old to understand Facebook. They don't really understand how it works. I mean, you heard their question, it just sounded like they didn't have a clue. Okay, well, you don't use Facebook. Go look it up. Go talk to your kids. Go talk to your grandkids. Figure out how it works. And yet some of them didn't do that. And that's part of the theatre of hearings. Why would you do something like that? In some instances, we have a good clue that it's because a lot of these representatives get money from Facebook. Facebook donates to their campaigns. And, you know, there are elections on the way, so they've got to be careful. They've got to look as if they are participating in this so-called grilling of Mark Zuckerberg without really participating in a grilling of Mark Zuckerberg. There was another group of representatives who were asking very sharp questions. And one of the things that we know from sort of these big, very public congressional hearings is that when you see representatives really kind of going after the witness, it's because they're setting up their platform to bring legislation to the House. Okay? And it's very likely that a lot of representatives don't particularly want to bring legislation that will curtail companies like Facebook. It's not necessarily in their interest to do so, which is one of the reasons they won't want to appear as if they are expert during the hearings. For those who do, look out for their names against a piece of legislation. There was at least one representative who promised Mark Zuckerberg that legislation was on the way, which I thought was a very interesting thing to say. So you're warning him ahead of time so he can go and lobby you for the exact wording of that legislation. Now, I know that Mark Zuckerberg's personal performance became the subject of memes on the internet, and some of them were very funny. But the thing is, he's been chairman and chief executive of this company for a very long time, and it strikes me that no one was asking any of the questions that I actually wanted to know the answer to. One of them is how, with a company, particularly a company as large as Facebook is, it's a publicly owned company, it's a global company, How do we still, in this era of supposed interest in corporate governance, allow someone like Mark Zuckerberg to be both chairman and chief executive of the company? I think that is one of the most important questions, and yet investors don't seem to be particularly interested in asking it, and nor were politicians. And as members of the public here in the UK, we're involved. We're involved in this even more than some, US citizens are. That's a really big and important question. Another very, very important question for somebody who was not on the public stage in that hearing is for Facebook's Chief Operating Officer. That's the job title, Chief Operating Officer. And yet, Sheryl Sandberg didn't seem to be quite clear about what was going on in the operations. And there may be reasons for that. But I think, again, investors, users of Facebook, politicians need to be looking at the governance of the board and senior management of Facebook. It doesn't seem to be fit for purpose. Just generally, something should be dealt with because we are dealing with companies that are monopolizing a particular market. And they're not just monopolizing a market, they're also monopolizing media and in many ways advertising activity. So there are a couple of issues here. The shorter answer is 100%. I think that companies of this size do need to be broken up. The problem is, recent history tells us it's probably not going to happen. Or it's probably not going to happen until we get to the sort of crisis from which there really is no return. I think from Facebook's perspective, they still seem to see the Cambridge Analytica events as a kind of a blip on the radar. And they've come out, they've been apologizing for years, There's been some very good articles pointing out how many times Mark Zuckerberg has come out and apologized with using almost exactly the same two sentences he used the last time around. So we still don't seem to have got to that point of no return with companies of this size. And we saw this with financial institutions, the banks, leading up to the financial crisis. These were, many of these institutions had got too big. And yet the Competition and Markets Authority seemed to be okay with that. Investors seemed to be okay with that. And people will go on being happy with Facebook and Google as long as they're getting their return on investment. But the second issue, and I think this probably is more important in the short term, is that as public companies, I think we really do need the support of our regulators and our political directorate in saying that these are not tech companies, they are media companies. They are media companies that use current forms of digital technology. But to call Facebook and Google nothing more than technology platforms is the same as saying that a television channel is nothing more than a transmitter. That's exactly what they're trying to get us to believe. They need to be treated like media. And I would really prefer to see the US make inroads on this, because what's so important with the US system is that the media actually has a role carved out for it in the Constitution of the United States, whereas Britain doesn't have anything concrete in terms of the role for the media. So it would really be ideal if the movement started there. But, if we have to start it here in Britain, that's where it'll need to happen. Has the idea of the banker in the bowler hat with the cane and the briefcase now been replaced by the tech guy wearing his t-shirt, cut-off shorts, on his skateboard, probably with Bluetooth in his ear? Probably. It's probably. I think you're absolutely right. And in terms of who we venerate in society when we look at business, yes, I think that's true. I mean, to some extent, the media has a role to play in this, because when the media are looking for stories, it is really appealing to look for these big personality stories, to look for the entrepreneur, and to kind of write mythologies about entrepreneurs. I cannot tell you how many stories I have seen about tech entrepreneurs that makes it sound as if they pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, when invariably they did no such thing. Dad knew a guy in a hedge fund, is much more likely to be the trope of the tech entrepreneur. But they do really look cool. And that particular kind of image allows us to think that you can become a billionaire with probably not doing too much work. That's got to be appealing. I mean, at least the fuddy-duddy banker, he looked like he probably had a boring time doing his job. And he wasn't a billionaire either, you know. The guy who ran your neighborhood bank was not a billionaire. The tech entrepreneur, wow. I mean, the only thing better than that might be being a rock star, and even a rock star has to work harder. That's how it looks to us. So I think it is a very, very appealing image. And we probably would be better off having more fly on the wall stories, understanding the way that communication works in some of these tech companies. We get an inkling of this when people leave, you know, companies like Facebook or Google or some of these other firms, and you know, then maybe they do an interview and they talk about what it's like, and then the company comes down on them like a ton of lead and says, thou shalt not say anything else, this is a contract you signed, you're not allowed to speak ever again. But you know, some of the insights that we get into what it's like to work for some of these companies, certainly one of the articles I was reading recently was suggesting that whereas in the good old days of a tech startup where maybe it's a small kind of family type setting and everybody is working hard, everyone from the chief executive down to the person at the bottom of the rung, and everyone possibly is working on a permanent basis. Now, when we look at the strata in some of these companies, you actually have an us and them. They're the ones who were lucky enough to be in the company when it floated on the stock market, and they have, many of them, become millionaires or at least very well to do. And they're still sitting pretty. Some of them have left so they can say what they like. But then you have this other very, very large strata of people working for these companies who are working on very precarious contracts. Not necessarily kind of the 0 hours contract, which has become so kind of taboo in Britain, but they don't necessarily know what kind of paycheck they're going to be taking home at the end of the month. They're working in a much more piecemeal fashion. Doing piecework is really what I'm talking about here. And as that kind of inequality begins to grow in some of these companies, I think we will begin to learn that these mythologies that we like and admire so much are not necessarily the truth. But we'd get there faster if there was enough political will to just deal with the monopoly status of some of these companies. I think it would be better and healthier for all of us if that were to happen.